I'd like to start by thanking all of the groups who are here today, and indeed the ones we're going to see later. To my mind, I have 3 years' worth of evidence that this government has abandoned borrowers in distress in this country. And I think the groups before the committee today, and some of the ones who are coming in later, the ones who are coming later on this evening, are trying their best to fill that gap. We had a Taoiseach who in the chamber today rubbished the idea that there could possibly be one repossession a day going on in the country. So not only have they turned their back, whereas in fact there are several repossessions a day going on in the country, as we all know. So we have a government that is both in denial and delusional. It would seem to me we've had the nationwide mortgage book now sold to 2 distressed asset firms out of the US. Michael Noonan said that, quote, it's a hugely successful outcome for the special liquidator. So as long as we define screwing Irish families for the profit of foreign vulture funds as hugely successful, I would agree with Minister Noonan. And he said he's extremely pleased with the progress. These are the tens of thousands of Irish men and women who weren't allowed to bid on their own mortgages whilst they were sold at a discount. Now, there's 3 issues for me: quality, quantity, and consistency. Now, the government is pushing on the quantity measure through the targets, whilst completely ignoring the quality of the measures and the inconsistency. Could I ask all of you just to talk a little bit more about the inconsistency? Deputy McGrath has already spoken to it. I have a huge problem with it as well. In other words, Bank of Ireland will screw you, whereas AIB won't. If you're with Bank of Ireland and you're in trouble, tough. Your life's going to be destroyed by Richie Boucher and his henchmen. Whereas if you're with AIB...
Please be careful how you use people's names.
Okay, Mr. Richie Boucher.
No, don't try not to use names at all.
Okay, by the Chief Executive of Bank of Ireland and his henchmen. Whereas if you're with AIB, that seems not to be the case. Can I ask, you are all dealing with this on the ground, to just give a little bit more flesh on the bone to how this inconsistency is playing out day by day for Irish citizens?
From our perspective, Deputy, we've got maybe 4,500 active files. And it is absolutely torturous. Leave aside the debtor for a moment. Anybody attempting to assist someone has in their own head a categorization in relation to various banks. And it's like anyone who goes to work and does something every day. Some things are easy, some things are difficult. That's exactly the same thing with some of the banks. The inconsistencies are absolutely horrific in relation to speaking to a bank, meeting a bank, arranging solutions, the way they determine the SFS, as MABS mentioned, in relation to what they determine from the SFS. There is in reality no functioning system there that's in any shape or form consistent. Trying to determine a consistency within one lender is in of itself dramatic. You mentioned, and the last time you guys asked the banks in relation to the legal queue, ask the banks next time they're back about what a legal queue is. Some say a legal queue begins when a solicitor's letter issues. Some say a legal queue is when they determine they entitle the letter legal. But the implications to get out of a legal queue in some lenders requires a 50% payment of your mortgage arrears or a 15% payment of your mortgage arrears. And it's complete and utter inconsistency. We have, of the 325 deals done in relation to AIB, 22% of those had repossession proceedings in their possession. And 22% of the existing people we have all have repossession proceedings. So the Taoiseach is wrong. There are many hundreds of repossession proceedings actively in being. AIB, for example, have handed out 1,800 cases to a number of organisations to try and intercept people prior to going to court. Yes, there's sensitivity. Bank of Ireland don't care. So there's monumental differences. This is back to the consistency around the CCMA too. There is no consistency. It is the Gaza Strip. You can do anything you want in any individual lender. Some are exiting the country, as Deputy Donnelly said. Some are trying to stay. Some are trying to show in the advertisements, we got you home safely. We might can keep you there, but we got you home safely. So there's a horrific inconsistency all over the place and landmines everywhere for every indebted person who is doing their best to try and navigate through an impossible situation with under-resourced, underfunded organisations, of which ourselves and others shouldn't be in existence, Deputy. We shouldn't be in existence. The House, the Oireachtas and the government have failed miserably. I shouldn't be here. I'm a volunteer for 3 years. I should not be here. Other organisations shouldn't be here. MABS should have been beefed up 3 years ago and given funding to deal with this on a holistic basis. And when someone mentions the Keane report and get all excited, we had the Keane report. There's a hypnotic sense they forgot. Within the Keane report was 100 additional mortgage advisors to help but that part gets forgotten about. So the inconsistencies are one of the major challenges that us as an organisation and others have to dealing with banks. And it's very dangerous because you're sitting behind someone or sitting across from somebody who thinks they're going to lose their family home and may very well lose their family home. And in the back of your mind, you're looking and saying, which bank is it? Have we a chance? Completely inconsistent.
Can I ask thank you very much. Can I ask FLAC and MABS for the same thoughts?
Good. If I can just echo a lot of what Mr. Hall has just said there. I think I applaud the initiatives with AIB and Irish Mortgage Holders Association. But my big concern is that it is just for a certain cohort of people. It is not available for everybody. And I witnessed the disillusionment and the disgruntlement and the pain of the clients coming into me who these options are not available for. Now, I'd like to go back to your comment, which I noted, Deputy Donnelly, in relation to quality. And it's the quality I am very concerned about. We have spoken at length about the quantity, but it's the quality. And I really wonder, are the standard financial statements being sufficiently stress tested? And I would suggest to you that they are not. Further, I think that there is a great need for somebody like MABS to monitor the arrangements to continually review it, particularly in relation to the split mortgages. I think somebody has to be there to assist and support the borrower for the review and for monitoring post-resolution. I think it's only then that we can deliver quality.
All of that is right. Everything David Hall has said, everything Anna Walsh has said is right. Think at the other end as well, you have to remember who the banks are sending out to deal with borrowers. They're sending out unqualified, inexperienced people who really only have a job of getting through a number of files in a particular time and reporting back to somebody who's really only interested in the figures at the end of it. There is no capacity to have a proper conversation with that. It depends on how terrified the person at the other end is as well. Of course, the borrower is terrified, but sometimes it seems to us that the person who is trying to manage it for the creditor is terrified as well. They're not trained, they're not doing the business in a professional way. They don't know the law around it. Inconsistency. Some of them, we had just during last week a case of somebody where we established that they were using guidelines which were kind of consistent with the insolvency service arrangement, and then they started asking about the €20 a week that was being spent on something or other. And you're having to go and say, look, we've been there, done that. So one recommendation would be, for instance, is could the banks accept at least the Insolvency Service of Ireland minimum guidelines and go over that, because as Carol Dunn was saying, people are people, and it's not always the... But could we at least start with not having to go through every tuppence on a standard financial statement? It would be something they could do immediately.
I think I'd add to what Nolan just said. All the banks have spending guidelines. They're there and they use them. And I think when you talk about negotiation, there is no negotiation with a person when you're dealing with a bank. You negotiate with a computer. The person who you meet puts the figures into the computer, but the computer spits out the answers based on a set of guidelines. If we knew what the guidelines were, and in some instances we do, and you can get a grasp of it from what the Insolvency Service have put about as reasonable, if you want to call them reasonable, living expenses. But there is no negotiation, and the consistency or lack thereof is based on how the computer is programmed, nothing else.
I think it's also important to note that the RLEs should be taken as an absolute minimum, because I think there is sometimes a temptation on the part of a borrower to say, we don't need that amount of money, we can manage on less. That should be something that's absolutely prohibited. That's an absolute no. And the other thing that we have found in terms of consistency is that even within lenders, we find that every 5 weeks, your relationship manager changes, so that there isn't even the potential for you to build a relationship, which obviously tells you that the intention is there is no rapport. So every time a money advisor commences a case, you'll find that 5 weeks later you're back to square one again.
Thank you.
Time have I got, Chair?
No.
None. Very super quick then, just final. Can I ask a question? We do focus quite rightly on the banks that are behaving poorly. Can I just ask you all, in your experience, are there any banks or lenders who are worthy of recognition for acting well in this crisis?
You're never ever going to get a positive answer to that when the current system that exists. With their experience, and the reason we did the arrangement with AIB and with KBC and our discussions with others is to have a specific channel that those people are fortunate enough to be able to be with those banks for that purpose, to have a humanitarian way of dealing with their crisis through a formal channel where decisions are made within roughly an 8-week period, as opposed to dealing with, as Carol said, a relationship manager. So until such time as there is a proper system to allow people to be afforded the support and help that they're needed, I'd respectfully suggest no one can bathe themselves in glory. There's unqualified, uncaring people, half of whom don't even have a damn mortgage themselves, making phone calls and harassing people for information. There are guidelines available to them. There are their own guidelines available. We interviewed 2 members of staff recently for 2 different lending institutions, and one of their key functions was discussing with someone how they could reduce the contents of their SFS in relation to hair products and in relation to food and entertainment. The guidelines exist. Those guidelines were debated the length and breadth of this House. They're already there, and they should be used as an absolute minimum. And ask the banks next time, what do they use as their guidelines? Ask your friend Mr. Boucher and others what they use as their guidelines and how close they are to those minimum guidelines.
Mr. Hall, I'm afraid the same response applies to you as I said, Deputy Director. No mentioning names, we're not here. Very brief comment, very brief now, because we are over time and I want to get all the other members in.
The answer to Deputy Donnelly's question is no, and a question I would suggest that you might ask the Central Bank when you see them is how many borrowers in arrears they have spoken to about how they're being treated under the mark, because there's a complete lack of proper monitoring and enforcement here as well.
Mr. Joyce.
Could I just say briefly that in our experience that lenders make themselves available to us to talk at a high level, but unfortunately although those discussions appear fruitful, they don't manifest into an improved customer experience on the ground. The other thing is that the age profile and the experience level of those who are actually making the calls to the customers is a cause for concern, and there are cultural issues as well that can't be overlooked in terms of the number of banks that are outsourcing their collections even out of state, and you have somebody maybe who's sitting in Scotland, for example, discussing an SFS with a woman who lives in Charleville, and he has no idea where Charleville is or what it means to live in that place. And those things can't be underestimated either when you're talking about somebody's home.